Welcome to this explainer. Look, we all know the legend of the Titanic, but today, we are skipping the broad strokes. We're going to dive deep into an extremely detailed, step-by-step documentary explanation of exactly what happened. I'm talking a minute-by-minute timeline, the cold mathematical certainties, and the very specific structural failures that doomed this supposedly unsinkable ship. Let's get right into it. So when you think of a shipwreck, you probably picture violent storms, right? Huge waves, crashing thunder. But on April 14th, 1912, the ocean was eerily, perfectly calm. Survivor Colonel Archibald Gracie literally said the sea was like glass. And ironically, this exceptionally calm water, which, by the way, is a known sign of nearby pack ice, actually made the iceberg nearly invisible. Without rough seas, there weren't any waves breaking against the iceberg's base to create that visible whitewater ring. Combine that glass-like surface with a completely moonless night, a deceptive soft horizon where the sea and sky kind of just blended together, and a mix-up back in Southampton that left the lookouts without binoculars, yeah, you've got a recipe for sudden absolute catastrophe. And man, this crisis escalated with terrifying speed. Okay, check out this timeline. At exactly 23:39, lookout Frederick Fleet spots the iceberg, rings the bell 3 times, and immediately phones the bridge. First Officer William Murdoch instantly orders the ship's wheel hard to starboard. He's attempting what maritime folks call a port around maneuver. Basically, he was trying to swing the bow left and then quickly swing the stern right to sort of slither past the ice. But here's the catch. The Titanic's steam-powered steering mechanism took up to 30 seconds to fully turn the tiller. The ship's heading did change just enough to avoid a direct head-on crash, but it resulted in a fatal 6-second glancing blow all along the starboard side, and just 25 minutes after that scrape, Captain Smith was already ordering the lifeboats uncovered. Now, deep down in the hull, engine oilers and firemen just heard this heavy thud and a grinding, tearing sound. The sheer volume of the breach was honestly staggering. Water started pouring into the ship at an estimated rate of 7 long tons. That is over 7 metric tons every single second. To put that into perspective for you, water was rushing in 15 times faster than the Titanic's pumps could possibly clear it out. Down in boiler room number 6, men were instantly hit by a jet of icy water. They had to desperately vent the high-pressure boilers so they literally wouldn't explode right there upon contact with the freezing sea. And that massive influx of water, it triggered a completely unstoppable chain reaction. So the Titanic was divided into 16 watertight compartments, separated by 15 bulkheads. But here is the fatal engineering flaw. These bulkheads extended all the way up to E-deck, sure, but they were not sealed at the top. The ship was actually designed to float with any 2 compartments flooded, or even her first 4. But the iceberg damaged the forepeak tank, the 3 forward holds, boiler room 6, and a section of boiler room 5. That's 6 compartments in total. Because 6 were breached, the bow was dragged heavily downward and the water simply spilled over the open tops of the bulkheads from one compartment right into the next. It was basically a deadly ice cube tray effect. Within minutes, Captain Smith and the ship's actual builder, Thomas Andrews, were down below inspecting the damage. Andrews saw the mailroom and the squash courts already flooding, and he did the brutal math. He had to look Captain Smith in the eye and tell him that with those first 5 compartments flooded, the ship was mathematically doomed. There was no saving it. He gave the captain a precise, terrifying time limit. The Titanic would remain afloat for roughly 2 hours, tops. But here's the thing. While the physics doomed the ship, human error and the rigid social structures of the time turned it into a massive catastrophe. The officers, who were actually unsure of the davit's strength, erred way on the side of caution. They refused to load the lifeboats to their full 65-person capacity, even though we now know it would have been perfectly safe to do so. Compounding this, there were hardly any trained seamen left to actually man the boats. A lot of them had been sent below to open gangway doors and tragically drowned as the water rose. And for the third-class passengers down on C through G decks, reaching the boats was an absolute nightmare. They faced a terrifying labyrinth of corridors, locked gates, and severe language barriers. Now, up on the boat deck initially, there was this fatal sense of hubris. The ship was massive, it was brightly lit, and honestly, it felt incredibly stable compared to that terrifying dark ocean down below. Millionaire John Jacob Astor even scoffed at the evacuation. He famously declared that they were safer right there on the ship than in that little boat. And this mindset made the crew's job of convincing passengers to actually evacuate incredibly difficult during those precious early minutes. Eventually, a trickle of people agreed to board starboard lifeboat number 7, but it was lowered with just 28 people aboard out of a possible 65. Just think about that.
So, to maintain calm as the horrifying reality of the situation slowly set in, the ship's bands were ordered to play in the first-class lounge and later out near the boat deck. They played cheerful tunes, bright dance music, and ragtime to prevent a full-blown panic. It was a somber and frankly incredible act of bravery that completely cemented their place in maritime folklore. Meanwhile, the pace in the radio room was just frantic. Operators Jack Phillips and Harold Bride were desperately firing off the standard CQD distress signal and eventually the newly adopted SOS. They managed to reach the RMS Carpathia, but she was 58 miles away and would take 4 long hours to arrive. Tragically, the SS Californian was stopped in the ice just 10 to 12 miles away, but its radio operator had literally gone to bed just 10 minutes before the Titanic struck the iceberg. No way.
Okay, let's pull back from the human drama for a second and look at the cold math again. From the time of the collision to her final plunge, at least 35,000 long tons of water had entered the hull. That is a staggering amount of weight, and it nearly doubled the ship's displacement. Because the water poured down a passageway on the starboard side first, the ship initially listed to the right. But as that flooded, it violently snapped to a port side list of up to 10 degrees. For the first hour and a half, the ship's downward angle changed very, very slowly, which gave people that false sense of security we talked about. But at 1:30 a.m., the sinking rate rapidly accelerated. By 2:15 a.m., water was pouring directly into open deck hatches, causing a sudden, violent lurch. A giant wave washed along the boat deck, sweeping people and the final collapsible boats right into the freezing water. The forward funnel, its supporting cables just snapping under the immense strain, collapsed under its own weight, crushing swimmers in the water and missing a lifeboat by mere inches.
As the massive bow sank deeper, the stern was lifted high into the night air. Survivor Jack Thayer described the ensuing sound, and it's chilling. He said it was like an express train passing overhead, mingled with a pressed steel factory and the wholesale breakage of China. This deafening roar was literally the sound of the ship's massive engines, boilers, and heavy machinery tearing loose from their mountings as the stern rose 30 to 45 degrees. It was all just smashing through the bulkheads as it fell forward into the submerged bow. A minute later, the lights flickered and permanently went out, plunging the 1,500 people still aboard into utter, absolute darkness.
Under this immense strain, the ship finally reached its structural breaking point. Think about it. The Titanic was being subjected to extreme opposing forces. You had the completely flooded bow pulling her violently down, while the air trapped in the stern was fighting to keep it buoyant. The ship literally broke apart right at the weak point of the engine room hatch. Now, there are 2 leading engineering theories on how exactly this happened. The top-down theory suggests that fracture tension ripped the upper decks apart first, sort of using the double-bottom keel as a hinge until it eventually snapped. On the other hand, the Mengot theory argues for a bottom-up break from compression forces. In this scenario, the ship actually buckled upwards and was briefly held together by 6 large doubler plates on B deck before those ultimately failed. Either way, those forces ripped the largest ship in the world clean in half. The bow and stern sections then began a terrifying descent to the ocean floor, nearly 4,000 meters down. It took only 5 to 6 minutes for them to hit the bottom. The streamlined bow descended at an estimated 25 to 30 miles per hour, striking the seabed with such incredible force that it buried itself 20 meters deep in the mud. The stern, which was badly damaged and completely open to the water, fell almost vertically. It spiraled and actually imploded as the trapped air in the cofferdams violently rushed out. The stern pancaked onto the ocean floor, and debris just rained down across the seabed for hours, leaving the 2 main sections 600 meters apart from each other. Meanwhile, on the surface, hundreds of people were left struggling in the pitch-black ocean, among the floating wreckage. But it wasn't the drowning that claimed most of them. It was the temperature. The water was absolutely lethal, sitting at -2 degrees Celsius or 28 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, while pop culture often blames hypothermia, the immediate killer here was actually cold shock and cardiac arrest. Immersion in freezing water causes an uncontrollable gasping reflex and immense, sudden strain on the heart, which led almost all of those in the water to perish within just 15 to 30 minutes. The sounds of this aftermath were deeply traumatizing for the survivors who'd made it into the lifeboats. Second Officer Lightaller described the freezing water as feeling like 1,000 knives. The few survivors safe in the boats were just paralyzed by this horrifying chorus of screams in the darkness. Jack Thayer compared it to locusts on a summer night, just a dismal moaning sound. And then, as the cold shock really took its toll, the agonizing cries slowly faded into a deeply traumatic, dead silence. Out of the hundreds in the water, only about 13 were pulled into the lifeboats, despite those boats still having room for almost 500 more people. When the RMS Carpathia finally arrived around 4 a.m., The rescue numbers starkly and tragically reflected the rigid class and gender divides of the Edwardian era. They eventually pulled 710 survivors from the lifeboats, but look at these disparities. Over 90% of first and second class women survived. Meanwhile, only 46% of third class women made it. The lowest survival rate belonged to second class men, suffering a staggering 92% death rate. And most heartbreakingly, while 5 out of 6 first class children were saved, 52 out of the 79 children in steerage perished. Proximity to the boats, language barriers, and the strict adherence to the women and children first rule absolutely dictated these unyielding statistics. The sheer shock of the disaster forced a complete and total reckoning of maritime law. The public outrage on both sides of the Atlantic was immense. Inquiries were immediately held in the US and the UK. And while they largely deemed it an act of God and found no criminal negligence against the White Star Line, the disaster completely rewrote safety protocols. It led directly to the creation of the International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea, or SOLAS as we know it today. Ships were now mandated to carry enough lifeboats for every single soul on board. Radio communication was required to be monitored 24/7, and the International Ice Patrol was established to constantly track hazards in the North Atlantic. Today, the wreck of the Titanic sits quietly on the seabed, steadily decaying by an estimated half to a full ton of metal every single day, slowly being consumed by rust and the immense pressure of the ocean. But the lessons of that freezing April night remain absolutely crucial. As the physical ship vanishes, we are left to ponder the human element. You see, the Titanic was considered the pinnacle of human engineering, a marvel we genuinely believe nature could not touch. So as you think about the exact mechanics and the tragic series of errors we've explored in this explainer, we have to ask ourselves, are we still capable of the same deadly hubris today? And what modern technological marvels are we trusting with that same blind, unsinkable faith?